So yeah, we are in some interesting times at the Hunterian Museum in terms of repatriation in particular. Now, we've been doing a lot of work on this area over the last 3 to 4 years. And this is intended essentially to bring you up to speed on what's been going on there. So a lot's changed at the Hunterian since 2020. We now have bespoke repatriation and human remains policies for our collections. And I was involved very closely with Malcolm Chapman, our head of collections management, in writing the initial drafts of that, as well as the senior management team as well. So where these new policies significantly changed or enabled the approach, in my opinion, was in taking the view that we should proactively pursue the repatriation of one specific area of the museum's holdings, human remains. Now, this doesn't mean that we are not open to the repatriation of anything in the World Cultures Collection, for example, that I curate, but that we are enabled to take specific action to achieve the repatriation of human remains in particular. So, to the Hunterian's credit, we were actually among the first wave of museums in the UK to undertake the repatriation of Toi Moko, Maori preserved ancestral heads, which were collected from here by the repatriation team of Te Papa Tongarewa, the National Museum of New Zealand in Wellington, in 2009. So that was good news in terms of us achieving these aims overall. However, we have not undertaken any repatriations since that time. And this is perhaps in some part because we haven't been approached by any originating communities. And this is, it's quite surprising in a way. I think it's often the case that people think that as soon as museums open themselves up to repatriation, then repatriation requests will flood in. But that doesn't appear to be the case, certainly in my experience anyway. So this is the great advantage of us having policies which enable us to take this proactive approach where human remains are concerned. We can initiate procedures and conversations where that wasn't possible in terms of our policy before. So before we come to those procedures, however, it's probably useful for me to say a few words about why the repatriation of human remains is so important in the context of the Hunterian Museum in particular. So there's William Hunter, as you all know. So something we all know about the Hunterian as a museum is that it was founded by the 1783 bequest of William Hunter's private collection, which was delivered here to Glasgow in 1807. So Hunter, being the preeminent British anatomist of his time and a real forerunner in the preservation of both human and animal tissues, gave the University of Glasgow a very diverse collection of anatomical specimens. Now, this gift converged with the university's already very strong tradition of medical training and research to lay the groundwork for an extremely rich and diverse anatomy collection. Although there are certainly some anatomical specimens in Hunter's collection that would today cause us serious concerns ethically, the relation of this material to societies outside of Britain is presently unclear. Certainly the extent of it, we believe that the vast majority of Hunter's anatomical specimens are essentially English. So Hunter acquired the vast majority of his research and teaching cadavers in London, and we generally have few reasons to look further afield in relation to that material. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider this early material in relation to human remains repatriations, but what it does mean is that our gravest and most urgent problems generally come from other sources rather than Hunter's founding collection. So where things really start to take a dark turn is when we look at the material added to the Hunterian's anatomy collection and its World Cultures Collection, or for the vast majority of its life ethnography collection, as it was called, during the mid to late 19th century. So here, the collection of skulls is the principal area of concern. I'm sure you're all familiar with this particular trend in museum collections. So in this period, craniometry, the measuring of skulls, came into vogue in both the comparative anatomy of the world's populations, as well as the pseudoscience of phrenology. So cranial features were postulated as being indicators of all manner of human characteristics, from general intelligence to criminal inclinations, mental health, and so on. So in this context, skulls became scientific, quote unquote, commodities in a late 19th century worldview, scientific racism. So this energized a worldwide practice of Western grave robbing and the collection of human remains in other unethical manners. Museums being what they are, such collections of human remains, as well as any associated grave goods that may or may not have come with them, will continue to remain in our collections unless and until we proactively achieve their repatriation. And this is very important. So we are facing the legacies of 100 years of unethical behavior, essentially. So the University of Glasgow, and especially its past professors of anatomy, several of whom were honorary curators for the Hunterian, played a central role in promulgating this discourse of scientific racism in Scotland. And therefore, we have inherited a collective responsibility for undoing the legacies of that injustice in the present, to whatever extent that can now be achieved. So to give you some sense of the scale of this problem, the sheer number of human skulls from around the world that were accumulated here in the University of Glasgow, John Cleland, the second in this series of 3 anatomy professors, published a catalogue of human crania arranged and displayed in the Anatomy Museum in 1909, which included people from every continent on Earth and ran to more than 270 skulls. And this catalogue is a hand guide, essentially, to the display of skulls that was in the Anatomy Museum in 1909, intended for the use of students of anatomy in that period. So this comprised skulls acquired by his predecessor, Alan Thompson, as well as himself, plus donations of skulls from various past students of anatomy in various parts of the world. This accumulation of human skulls from around the world is intimately related with the University of Glasgow's history as an institution producing medics that then travelled to all of the different parts of the British Empire and many other parts of the world as well. And this set of racially classified skulls is in addition to over 600 skulls all acquired from Glasgow cemeteries in the same period. So you should be able to understand from that the scale of the skull collection that presently exists in the Hunterian. So in early 2022, our zoology and anatomy curator, Mike Rutherford, and myself attempted to locate all of these 270 people in the current collection, but we were only able, having looked through all of these 800 plus skulls, we were only able to identify slightly more than 100 of them, 100 of the people who were on the list. So it seems that many have possibly been cremated, but we are lacking any records that would indicate that in a conclusive way. Similarly, we don't have exit books at the Hunterian, so we don't know what material has been deaccessioned or transferred to other institutions over the museum's extremely long, more than 200 years of history. So thereafter, having essentially failed to find the vast majority of these listed skulls of the races of the world as they're described in this catalogue, we decided to begin undertaking a program of repatriations for all of the non-European human remains that are in the museum where descendant communities would seek their return. So, although in some cases, the national museums of some countries, the prime example being Te Papa Tongarewa in Wellington, New Zealand, and in other cases, diplomatic services, such as the Australian High Commission in the Australian case, these organizations, either museums or government departments, have stepped up, formalized a repatriation protocol for human remains, and taken on the role of mediating with foreign museums and foreign governments to achieve the repatriation of their stolen ancestral citizens. This is still very much the exception rather than the rule. So this means that repatriations rarely have a simple and smooth solution to them. Unfortunately, each repatriation has to be individually negotiated and developed collaboratively in a bespoke way. Everything is an individual achievement in that way. So in my remaining time, I'm just going to run through some of the ongoing repatriation projects that we are involved in and what we intend to do from here. So, South Africa, we have 6 San or Khoi people and 2 face casts of San or Khoi people in our anatomy and world cultures collections. So, during the second half of 2021, myself, Mike Rutherford, Jane Stewart, and various other members of the Hunterian staff worked on delivering the museum's participation in a UK-based multi-institutional project on African collections that was called Devolving Restitution. So, given the Hunterian's history, we chose to focus on South African human remains in the online public event that we held as an outcome of that in December 2021. Now, during that event, we worked closely with 2 curators from Iziko Museums Cape Town, Dr. Wendy Black and Annalisa Kurtzer, who are respectively Iziko Museums curators for archaeology and social history. So research into the 6 South Africans in the Hunterian's collection allowed us to discover that we had one particular shared donor of human remains with the South African Museum. The Iziko Museum's flagship museum is the South African Museum in Cape Town. And that person was a British medic called Dr. Percy Ward Laidler. So we knew that there was more collaborative work to be done there to discover exactly what Percy Laidler was doing during the 19-teens, 1920s, and 1930s when he was collecting human remains in South Africa and both shipping them to Cape Town to the museum there and also to here, and as well as I think probably other institutions in the UK too. So this led on to my undertaking curatorial exchange with Annalisa and Wendy in the summer of 2022, which was funded by the John Ellerman Foundation. And this enabled us to travel to the Northern Cape and meet with elders of the Kamani San to discuss what they wanted to happen to the remains of their ancestors that are in museums in the UK. So only 3 main repatriations have so far been undertaken in South Africa. So we're trying to use this as the pilot project to establish a general working model for repatriations between the UK and South Africa. And to understand where the specifics are in that process. So it's likely that a communal burial ground will be the best solution here, but we're waiting to hear more from the SAN and the South African government about details there. Now, the reason why I say it's likely the communal burial ground will be the best solution is because one of the things that we discovered whilst working with Iziko and whilst working with the Kamani San is that it's very often the case that South African human remains are classified as being San, or Bushmen, as they were called by Europeans throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, and they're often accessioned into collections in the UK as San or Bushmen. The reality is, however, that in the Northern Cape province, San, Khoi, Griqua, and other ethnic groups are interdigitated throughout the entire province. And so the idea that a visiting European who was intent on digging up people's burials and taking them away could know accurately the ethnicity of a person whose grave they were robbing is essentially a fantasy. So the reality is we don't essentially know with any degree of certainty what cultural group these human remains that are in UK museums belong to. That's just a kind of progressively concretized and reified concept of what these human remains represent rather than the people that they actually are. And because of that, it's impossible to know who is the correct community to return a person's remains to. So in that situation, what solution can we have? And so one of the things that I was particularly keen to talk to the Kamani San about was whether a communal burial ground would be a viable alternative in that situation to being able to return them to a given community for appropriate reburial. And they seemed extremely open to that. Actually, they mentioned it before I had even raised the subject with them. So it's a very interesting possibility. Now, where things become tricky is when you start to get involved with the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture in South Africa, both in the Northern Cape itself and also in Johannesburg and in Cape Town, where the seats of government are. So there's a whole series of essentially, bureaucratical challenges there that I certainly was naively not imagining being part of this process, but certainly is extremely central to it. So we are currently waiting to see what news will come back from the South African government about that, and that seems to be taking some time. So I'll hopefully update people on that as we progress. Now, moving on to Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have in both our anatomy collections and our world cultures collection 16 skulls of Maori people. Like the San in southern Africa, the New Zealand Maori are among a small set of ethnic groups who were particularly persecuted by the late 19th and early 20th century skull collectors. Theoretical reasons within this discourse of scientific racism that meant that certain people around the world were particularly interesting to these racist skull collectors, but I'm not going to go into that. So as I mentioned, we repatriated some human remains to New Zealand in 2009. However, somehow in undertaking this, the Hunterian omitted to explore whether the museum also had skulls as well as preserved heads with soft human tissue on them as well. There were 15 Maori skulls, and then my brother has just discovered another one more recently, so we're up to 16 skulls that we need to send home to New Zealand now, and we're seeking to return them as soon as possible. So New Zealand, as I mentioned, is probably the nation with the most highly developed system for the repatriation of human remains. In this case, the National Museum Te Papa, which you can see an image of here, has been given the responsibility of overseeing this, and it has a government-funded team to work on this and nothing else. So, however, the sea change in the ethics of museums over the last 3 years, coupled with coronavirus effectively closing New Zealand completely for almost 2 years, means that when we recently heard back from their repatriation team, they told us that they have a backlog of over 450 people to collect from the world's museums, and they hope to collect ours later next year. Now, this should give you some kind of sense of the dreadful scale of the theft of human remains from New Zealand and other countries that there are in 3 years. There has been an accumulation of 450 people around the world that need to be returned home. So in the case of the Hunterian, fortunately, we have good information on the burial caves and hill forts for about half of these Maori people, for the places where they were buried and stolen from. And so we hope that these people at least can be returned to the iwi, the Maori clans, from whom they were taken. And this is often not the case. In the case of in New Zealand, it's very often the case that museums have human remains that are simply designated as being Maori, and therefore they cannot be by any means returned more specifically than to the National Museum. And Te Papa currently have more than 2,000 sets of human remains in the basement store of their museum that the government and the iwi still have not come to a finalized decision about what can be done to return those people to their appropriate place of burial. Now then, moving on, Ireland. So we have 6 Irish people in the museum. So I'm including this case mainly because I don't want you to think that this is only something that we are doing for our non-European human remains. Some of you probably know the Irish were also subjected to these same pernicious practices of racial objectification and hierarchization. And Alan Thompson and John Cleland also acquired 6 Irish skulls to arrange in their series of skulls of the races of the world. So in working on this material, we've been incredibly lucky to be contacted by Dr. Kieran Walsh, an Irish academic with a specialist interest in the collection of human remains in the 19th century and the early 20th century in Ireland. And he's been involved with the recent repatriation of some skulls to Inishbofin in Ireland from Trinity College Dublin. I don't know if any of you saw that in the news. So Kieran was particularly involved in bringing that about. His PhD was specifically on the human remains collections of Trinity College Dublin. And he's been working very closely with the community in Inishbofin Ireland to achieve that repatriation. So in the Hunterian's case, the attribution of our human remains is to 2 monastic houses on either side of Galway Bay. And this has allowed Dr. Walsh to likely attribute them to a grave robbing tour that was undertaken by a group of Irish and British ethnologists or early anthropologists, where a large number of skulls were removed from these 2 sites and distributed to a number of universities in Ireland and in Scotland and in England and so on. So through Dr. Walsh's efforts in contacting the local parish priest and with the assistance of county archaeologists in County Clare and in Galway, we are hoping to repatriate and rebury these 6 people in the parishes that they were taken from in the next year. And I think, particularly in the case of monks, medieval monks, essentially, we know with a certainty that these are people who were given Christian burials, and that they intended to await the resurrection. And therefore, the very best thing that we can possibly do is to try and undo this grave robbing in as accurate a sense as possible and return them to as close to their point of origin as we possibly can. So that's pretty much all I have to talk to you about. So hopefully this gives you a taster of the kind of work that we're undertaking to undo these material legacies of scientific racism in the Hunterian's anatomical and anthropological collections. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about this, and I also want to leave you with some idea of the other human remains repatriations that we have begun or have ahead of us to undertake. So in addition to these repatriations of skulls and other skeletal remains, we have more than 100 artifacts in the World Cultures Collection, which contain human tissue. These are usually worked bone or human hair. Several of these are of a sacred and or ancestral nature, and therefore we may well find ourselves repatriating such artifacts too. So thank you very much for your time. And I just want to list this. We are currently also planning to undertake repatriations of human remains to India, to China, to Myanmar, Burma, to Australia. We have Native American people to return home and Canadian First Nations people to return home. We have Peruvian people to return home. We have several other human remains that are designated simply as African, and we have a very large range of other Europeans to return home to various countries, France, Italy, Norway, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that gives you some sense of the scale of the problem that we've inherited and also the scale of the work that we have in front of us to undertake. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Andy. It's obviously, a really dark topic, but it is brilliant to see the kind of positive work that's been put into, really affect some change there. If anyone does have any questions, as Andy said, please do either pop them in the chat, or you're welcome to stick your hand up and take yourself off mute. It's really up to you. Andy, I was interested just when you were talking about not just the history of, the Hunterian, but of the university in general and, the medical department and the collecting of skulls. Is there any evidence of, like protests from, not protests, but, a pushback against kind of like collecting human remains illegally from, the university's records from 100 years ago? Is there any evidence of that at all, or?
Not
Was
that
it was just the way things were, and no one contested it?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. That doesn't mean that it didn't exist. And I think, one of the things that is very interesting about this particular subject is that it's always been at the fringe of conventional Western values. Something that's really come home to me in researching characters like Thomas Steele, who grave robbed a lot of the Maori human remains in New Zealand, for example, and like Percy Ward Laidler as well, who, as I say, was sending human remains to both Cape Town and Glasgow, is that a small number of very active individuals in grave robbing have had vast effect, essentially. I mean, Thomas Steele, when we contacted Te Papa Tongarewa in New Zealand and told them that we had human remains that had been collected by Thomas Steele, the repatriation team members that got back to us said, "Oh yes, we know him." That not the Hunterian is not in any way, shape, or form the only museum in the world to have human remains material collected by Thomas Steele. So I think that if you're a European and you don't want to think too badly of our own ancestors, then I think it's reassuring on some level to know that a small number of individuals were doing this rather than it being a very widespread practice. And I think, very often it's, when you read people's descriptions of, for example, William Hunter's anatomy school and how shocking people in London found it, at the time that there was, this place on Windmill Street in Soho where people's cadavers were being, cut open all of the time and that kind of thing. I think, it's always been at the very edge of what most people find acceptable. But, that's, I suppose, the nature of scientific knowledge and exploration in general, isn't it? Beyond the boundaries of what most people would consider able to be done in that way. But I do think it's interesting that there doesn't seem to have been any great degree of protest about that. But one of the characteristics, I suppose, of a lot of objects and specimens, anatomical preparations and so on that are in our collections is that they were produced by very specialist and specialized people for the study of students who are also becoming equally specialist and specialized, and not really ever meant, I think, for the general public. Probably for precisely those reasons that they are so shocking, I think, for lots of people.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think it.
No, that was great. Thank you, Andy. We've got a question here from Kit, just in the chat there, Andy. How difficult was it to convince the Hunterian that repatriation was necessary? And since the first repatriation was in 2009, when did the issue first come up?
I think it's, I don't know how much you know about the history of museums, Kit, but I think that the repatriation of human remains has been going on for certainly at least the last 3 decades in one form or another, from museums in the UK and elsewhere in Europe as well, obviously. So I don't think it's particularly, the discourse itself is not particularly new. I think that there has been, these things go in waves, don't they, in museums? And certainly there was, when we undertook that repatriation in 2009, the Maori, I think, were really breaking a seal on global perspectives in museums about what it was acceptable for museums to hold, particularly from their country. And I think from that, priorities in museums, I think they move on and then they come back to the same subjects again, and then they move on again and they come back to the same subjects again. So I think we're, living through another wave of that now, and hopefully we can achieve as much or more as was achieved 15 years ago in that regard. And I think that is possible. I don't think there was any resistance from the museum as a whole to this. I think everybody in the museum, certainly everybody I've spoken to in the museum, thinks that it's the right thing for us to do. And I think, one of the things about museums that I've noticed recently is that things that obviously seem perfectly acceptable to people here in Scotland 100 years ago now are in no way, shape or form, tenable. So I think we have to move with the times in that regard. But one of the problems about museums being things that keep material from the past is that unless we, as I said, take this proactive approach to them, then we will always be in this situation. So I think it's an interesting time to work in museums, and things are much more easy to achieve than they would have been in any museum in the UK probably 40 years ago, because there is no longer a need to convince people that it is unacceptable for a museum in Scotland to hold Maori human remains or Aboriginal Australian human remains or Native American human remains. That's it's no longer an issue for debate, so we can move on that quite easily.
Great, thank you, Andy, and thanks, Kit, for your question. Well, I've got a question here as well from Joe. You mentioned these first restitutions may become case studies for future work. Will these studies be published anywhere to help inform wider best practice in academic study?
Thank you, Joe. Well, I don't know. I think for us particularly, it remains for us to actually achieve something. I mean, we're in this peculiar kind of no man's land at the moment of waiting for various governmental agencies in various countries to get back to us. I was on the telephone to the Irish Customs and Revenue a couple of days ago, which was not an experience I ever intended to have in my life. But the thing, I suppose, is in terms of South Africa, I think, because there has only been there were 3 major repatriations of human remains. Sarah Baartman, famous case, which many people who study museums know about Sarah Baartman, but also Klaas and Troy Pienaar. When those 3 people were repatriated, they were very much, I think, breaking new ground in South Africa. And obviously in South Africa, everything is, because of the context and the history of racial tension and apartheid and everything else, I think that's a really complicated situation, and it's very interesting to be involved in that, but we're really still waiting to find out how that's going to turn out, and what the process is going to be. And so I think it's interesting to see how one develops those things in different situations. It's interesting to be involved with Te Papa and see how they do it in this incredibly slick and professional way, where they take complete control, and they have a system which is very, very polished. And then in other situations, we are still really trying to figure out how it's done, and what's the best way to do it, in terms of what people want, and how government can affect that and how we can facilitate that. And then in other situations, I mean, we have a repatriation of Peruvian human remains that we know needs to happen, of a similar scale in terms of numbers of people to the South African case and the Irish case. But I certainly have never heard of anybody repatriating human remains to Peru. And I think particularly with archaeological human remains in a country like Peru, where archaeology plays such an important role in the country's cultural heritage, then I think you're in again a different, interesting territory, which we need to find out how to do that, how to begin doing that, because I don't know if there are any precedents there for that. But it will be very interesting and instructive to learn how to do that.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Andy. Andy, I was wondering about the, human remains and artifacts that we have in the collection that, we can't repatriate, that we don't have the records for, we don't know where they come from, or they can't be repatriated for other reasons. Do we have plans for those items, for those human remains yet? If they do need to stay essentially in the Hunterian collection?
Yeah, I think I've talked with Malcolm Chapman, our head of collections management, about this, and other members of the collections management team, that we do have an intention to provide a specific space in our stores where human remains in various forms can be treated with a level of enhanced respect and privacy, so that we can take better care of those artifacts, if you like. And in most of the situations where the human material is of a sacred status, for example, then I think really we should be trying very hard to get those kinds of artifacts back to the countries that they came from. But you're right. I mean, there are some things that we are not going to be able to achieve that with, or which it may take us literally decades to achieve rather than a matter of years. So we do need to have a management approach. One of the things that we've talked about is particularly defining collections as being either ethically collected or unethically collected. And this is something that Iziko museums have done with their entire human remains collection. And I think it's important for us to realize, and this, particularly applies to our own Scottish ancient human remains as well, that we need to understand that there are legitimate reasons and ethical ways by which human remains can be collected for archaeological research and that kind of thing. And we are not simply saying, oh, museums should not have human remains in them at all. The question is, in what societies do we think or do we understand that it is unethical for human remains from that society to be kept by a museum, and how can we address those problems, and how can we appropriately care for the human remains that we have in the museum, that we are going to keep in the museum, and that we consider it to be ethical for us to hold. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that was brilliant. Thank you, Andy. Sorry, I realised that was quite a negative question, but no,
that's fine.
And I think we'll just get one final question or kind of comment from our colleague Lola. For when you mentioned like Peru repatriation, might it be interesting maybe to talk to other European museums, potentially Spanish?
Yeah,
what do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think the Museo de America in Madrid, they have done some really, really interesting work with their Peruvian collections, and they have I know they have really good relationships with obviously all of those former Spanish colonies in South America, and I think we have to take advantage of the expertise and experience of other museums, because there are many cases where somebody can be in Edinburgh or in Aberdeen or in London. The museum professionals are fully experienced in dealing with these issues that we are trying to grapple with. And I think, you know, it would be madness for us to reinvent the wheel. So it is really important, I think, when people have those experiences that they share them. But also, yeah, absolutely, I think we need to take advantage of those specialist areas of knowledge that we don't have. Certainly I don't have. Yeah.